The movie begins in the middle of the Vietnam War, showing the aftermath of a brutal clash. The only survivor is soldier Nick Parker, but he lost his sight after an explosion. Desperate, Nick crawls around looking for his friend Frank, although no one else is around. Due to his blindness, Nick ends up falling into a trap set by the local villagers, who, instead of seeing him as an enemy, take pity on him and welcome him into their village. Even though he has permanently lost his sight, Nick learns to perceive the world through his other senses, thanks to the villagers' teachings. Moreover, the village leader teaches him how to use a sword and throws fruit at him so he can cut it in midair. Naturally, at first, Nick can barely move without help. But over time, not only does he master his remaining senses, he also becomes an expert swordsman, slicing an airborne piece of fruit into multiple segments. After spending 20 years in the Vietnamese village, Nick decides to return to the United States to take care of unfinished business. Upon arriving in the outskirts of Miami, we see him skillfully maneuver around various obstacles such as trash, excrement, and even an alligator, which he mistakes for a puppy. When he stops to eat in a bar, some gang members take advantage of his disability by pouring a ton of hot sauce on his burrito. Surprisingly, Nick points out that the sauce is too mild and asks them for something spicier. The gang members then set their sights on their next victim, a young woman. At that moment, the girl's purse falls at Nick's feet, and he picks it up as if nothing happened. The leader of the thugs threatens him with a knife to make him hand it over, although Nick also has a weapon, his guide cane. With just a few swift moves, he takes out the gang members while pretending to apologize to them. Meanwhile, in Las Vegas, Nick's old friend and fellow war veteran, Frank, is about to be thrown off a building by McCready, a mobster who wants him to be his new drug chemist. Even in this predicament, Frank refuses to cooperate, so the mobster threatens to visit his family in Miami. Speaking of that city, we see Nick arriving at Frank's former home. Lynn, Frank's ex-wife, tells him that his friend no longer lives there. Out of courtesy, Lynn lets Nick stay in her home and introduces him to her son, the rebellious Billy. When Lynn steps away to prepare tea, the boy makes a rude gesture in front of Nick, who grabs his hand to make it clear he can see him in his own way. A few minutes later, the police burst into the house looking for Billy, supposedly because he was a witness to a crime, or at least that's what they say. Suddenly, a big guy named Slag appears, one of McCready's best henchmen. Slag immediately restrains Lynn and goes after Billy. The mobsters hit the boy, so Lynn rushes to protect him, but takes a shotgun blast from Slag. As Lynn is dying in Nick's arms, Nick slightly opens his cane, revealing a hidden sword inside. In a flash, Nick executes the fake cops, cutting off one man's hand before he can fire. Slag tries to confront him by moving as silently as possible, but even that isn't enough to avoid Nick detecting him. Given the circumstances, the big thug decides to flee. Nick turns his attention back to Lynn, who, with her last words, asks him to protect her son and take him to his father. Determined to fulfill that promise, Nick takes the unconscious boy with him. When Billy wakes up, the first thing he does is ask about his mother, and Nick replies that she's at home, but that he can't see her right now. Despite Billy's protests, Nick convinces him to board a bus bound for Reno, where his father lives. Along the way, Slag spots them during a stop. They're hit by a torrential rain shower that Billy refuses to go out in, fearing he'll catch a cold. Nick assures him that a little water doesn't hurt anyone, but shortly afterward, Nick slips in a puddle. Billy laughs at him, recalling his earlier comment, and soon ends up in the same predicament. Since Nick teased him about it, the boy hands him a rock, calling it a candy. After trying to swallow it, Nick spits it right into Billy's face. Back on the bus, Billy finds a photo of Nick and his father among Nick's belongings. Nick tells him how he became friends with Frank in a military camp. They endured hardships together right up to the end of their service. But just as they were celebrating their return home, the camp was hit by an enemy mortar. Nick and Frank were assigned to take out the enemies operating the mortar. Supposedly, Frank was supposed to cover Nick. However, when confronted with more enemies than expected, he didn't hesitate to flee, abandoning Nick. Nick kept fighting until a mortar blast struck his face, costing him his sight. Back in the present, Billy tries calling his mother at the next stop, leaving Nick no choice but to tell him the truth. Since Nick had lied to him initially, Billy walks away from him and slips into a mall, where Nick has trouble finding his way. Suddenly, Billy is intercepted by Slag, while Slag's associates begin hunting Nick. The problem for them is that they're too noisy, so the blind man ends up hunting them instead. He even scares them into shooting each other. Slag, for his part, waits on top of a small shack, from where he fires at Nick. However, it turns out to be just a scarecrow. The real Nick knocks down the shack and attacks Slag. He then reunites with Billy, giving him a hug and promising everything will be okay. As they resume their journey on foot, it's revealed that Slag is still alive, thanks to a special vest underneath his clothing. The next day, Nick and Billy arrive at Frank's place, but they're greeted by Annie, Frank's girlfriend, and the Pike brothers, two cowboys hired by McCready. Despite being rather incompetent, they manage to knock Nick out. He wakes up in the back of the cowboy's truck along with Billy, and he teaches Billy how to shift his tied hands in front of him. This way, Billy can reach Nick's lighter and free them both. Meanwhile, one of the mercenaries starts playing around with Nick's sword cane and ends up cutting himself. Angry, he throws it onto the road. Hearing that, Nick quickly burns through his bindings. Since Annie is seated next to them, she sees everything they're doing, but decides to distract the mercenaries. Finally, the Pikes stop because of the smoke coming from the rear. When they open the doors, they're greeted by Billy's fire extinguisher and a few punches from Nick. Annie offers to drive the truck, and because Nick counted the exact number of seconds from when the sword was thrown, he's able to return to the precise spot where it landed. Meanwhile, out on the road, the Pikes steal a car from two elderly ladies who happen to be armed, allowing them to continue the chase. By the time Nick retrieves his cane sword, the Pikes reappear and start shooting from afar. Everyone scrambles back into the truck. In the chaos, Nick accidentally steps on Annie's glasses, so she can't drive. Nick accepts the challenge, relying on his companion's directions. The mercenaries re-emerge with gunfire, and now the blind man must not only avoid cars and pedestrians, but also escape armed criminals. However, he seems to be having a great time driving, while his companions are scared out of their wits. The mercenaries try ramming their vehicle, but forget to watch the road, causing their car to flip over. After leaving Billy in the RV of Colin, a friend of Annie's, Nick sets off to find Frank, but not before saying goodbye to the boy, who now calls him Uncle. Later, Nick visits McCready's casino, where he overhears the mobster telling his associates that Frank's new product could save his business. He also hears McCready's right-hand man, Ed, entering a code into a panel to reach the exclusive floor. While Ed goes up, his bodyguards remain at the elevator. Nick draws attention to himself by winning a bunch of bets at the roulette table. The supervisor tries to take advantage of his disability, but Nick proves they're cheating. This triggers chaos in the casino. And of course, the Pike brothers don't want to miss out on the action. Nick takes advantage of the commotion to enter the code into the elevator and go up to the mobster's floor, while the Pikes and Ed's bodyguards take the regular elevator. After neutralizing the guards there, Nick senses the other elevator's movement and disables it by breaking the panel. Now he has a clear path to deal with Ed, whom he intimidates by slicing off his eyebrows in one swing. Nick obtains the key to Frank's room that way. Despite what Frank did to him in the war, Nick greets him with the same warmth as always and convinces him to leave so he can see his son. As a parting gift to McCready, Frank douses the lab with gasoline and sets it on fire. When they reach Colin's place, they find no trace of Billy. Approaching a motionless Colin, they discover a bullet hole in her head. Seconds later, McCready calls Frank to reveal he's holding his son and Annie at a ski resort, where Frank must hand over the new drugs in the morning if he doesn't want to see them die. Knowing they're headed into an ambush, Nick and Frank arm themselves with homemade napalm bombs, something they learned to make in the war. Referring to that, Frank apologizes for abandoning him, but Nick doesn't let him finish. He explains that he's not confessing to punish him, but to let Frank know he still loves him like a brother, and that by following through on their mission, Nick is also healing part of himself that was lost in the war. Having made their peace, the two veterans prepare for one final battle. As soon as they reach the top of the cable car, a bunch of mercenaries open fire on their cabin. However, Nick and Frank have already escaped through a panel in the floor. In the corridors of the station, they run into the Pike brothers. Nick immediately uses one of them as a human shield, outraged that his brother has just shot him. The mercenary shoots back, returning the favor. After that, more henchmen arrive and corner Nick and Frank. and Frank flees just like before. Although shocked by Frank's reaction, Nick must carry on fighting the criminals. Unfortunately, he ends up in a disco room where he can't hear properly. Suddenly, Frank turns off the fuses. Hidden in the darkness, Nick relies on the mercenaries' whispers to slaughter them with his sword, while Frank lobs napalm bombs. McCready, for his part, fails to keep his buyers interested in the product, as they're put off by the fact that a blind man is causing so many problems. Finally, Nick and Frank burst into McCready's suite, where he's holding Annie at gunpoint. Frank hands over a stash of drugs saved from the fire. Pleased, the mobster calls a henchman, Oprah Parker, a Japanese swordsman who throws an apple at Nick to test his ability. When the blind man slices it with no trouble, Parker attacks him full force, leading to an intense sword fight. As they trade blows, they reach a hot tub where they knock over a lamp that electrifies the water. Parker tries swinging on a rope to knock Nick into the tub, but Nick cuts the rope, causing Parker to fall into the electrified water and fry. But that's not the end of their troubles. Slag shows up from nowhere and shoots Nick in the side. Even so, Nick endures the pain and flings his sword at Slag's stomach. Slag manages to pull it out with great effort. Meanwhile, Frank uses the commotion to overpower McCready, and Billy tosses the sword back to Nick. However, due to Billy's poor aim, it lands in the hot tub. Thankfully, Nick manages to grab Parker's katana and uses it to slice Slag, sending him crashing out the window. Once peace is restored, Frank, Annie, and Billy prepare to take a bus to San Francisco. Nick was also part of that plan, but at the last moment, he throws away his ticket. Even though Billy tells him he needs him, Nick tenderly says his goodbyes, reminding him that his father needs him more. With one of Billy's toy dinosaurs as a souvenir, Nick heads off on his own journey, a future he can't clearly see, but finds exciting nonetheless.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.